The evaluation form listed Callum Reyes as the weakest technical candidate in the intake cohort. Someone in the assessment office had written in the notes field that his admission had been approved on a procedural basis. The phrase meant, in the specific language of institutional documentation, that no one expected him to last the semester. That notation was entered on a Thursday. 11 weeks later, the same office would quietly update his file with a different phrase entirely. No one would discuss the change in any formal capacity. The update would simply appear, the way corrections appear when institutions realize they have made a significant error and would prefer the record to reflect otherwise. The Interstellar Engineering Corps ran its technical certification program out of Meridian Station, a purpose-built facility positioned at the L4 point of a binary system in the Coalition's mid-rim territory. The program accepted candidates from 39 species. Its practical assessment component, referred to in the official curriculum materials as the Systems Integration Trial, and referred to by every cadet who had ever survived it as the pressure test, was administered in the final week of each semester. Candidates were given a non-functional ship system, propulsion, navigation, life support, structural integrity, and a fixed window of time in which to diagnose and restore full operational capability. The system chosen was always drawn from actual field conditions, a real failure, documented from a real mission, with all identifying information removed. The time window was set to match the conditions under which the original failure had occurred. The assessment was pass or fail. There was no partial credit. At the beginning of the current intake cycle, with 187 candidates enrolled across 6 species cohorts, the ranked performance list reflected what the program's assessment system had been designed to measure. First in the cohort was Vithara Kin, a Solari technical specialist whose cognitive processing architecture allowed simultaneous analysis across 14 parallel data streams, and whose species-specific engineering credentials already included 4 active patents filed with the Coalition Technical Registry. Her physical assessment scores placed her in the top 2% of candidates the program had ever evaluated. Her diagnostic accuracy rate on preliminary trials was 97.3%. Last in the cohort was Callum Reyes. He was 28 years old, from a mid-sized city in the Canadian interior, from a family that had been in the trades for 4 generations. He was 5'11", weighed 81 kilograms, and had arrived at Meridian Station with an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering from a mid-ranked provincial university and a work history that listed 3 years as a field technician for a regional utility company. His preliminary assessment scores placed him in the bottom 11% of enrolled candidates. His diagnostic simulation results, the exercises the program used to evaluate how quickly a candidate could identify the source of a system failure, averaged 23.7 minutes per scenario. The cohort average was 11.4 minutes. Vithara Kin averaged 3.1 minutes. His species classification in the program's baseline system had been entered as standard human, which was the category that existed because the program required every candidate to have a category. It was not a category that implied distinction. It was the category that meant nothing in the assessment system had flagged anything worth noting in either direction. What the assessment system had not been designed to measure, and therefore had not measured, was what Callum had been doing since he was 11 years old. His grandfather, Maurice Reyes, had spent 32 years as a field engineer for a northern pipeline company before his retirement. The pipeline ran through terrain that had a specific relationship with equipment. It broke things with consistency and without warning, in conditions that made waiting for a technical team impractical and occasionally fatal. Maurice had learned, over 3 decades, to diagnose and repair systems not by running them through analytical frameworks or diagnostic software, but by understanding them. The sounds they made when they were close to failure, the temperature distributions that preceded specific fault types, the way vibration patterns changed in the hours before a component gave out. He had learned to read machinery the way some people learn to read weather. It was not a system that could be easily described in technical documentation. It was not something that could be transferred in a classroom. It had been transferred over 17 years of weekends and summers and conversations in his garage Ed's workshop to his grandson. Maurice had died 3 years before Callum applied to the program. He had left Callum his tools, his notebooks, and a working knowledge of 14 different propulsion systems that were considered outdated by current industry standards, but which remained, structurally, the basis for nearly every design that had followed them. The program did not have a category for that. The pressure test scenario that produced the assessment pairing between Vithara Kin and Callum Reyes was not supposed to involve them in the same physical space. The standard format placed each candidate in a separate assessment bay, working independently under timed conditions, with their results compared after the fact. The competitive element was implicit rather than direct. What made this particular semester's final assessment different was a structural failure in bay allocation. 2 candidates had been withdrawn from the cohort 2 days before the assessment, leaving a bay assignment gap that the administrative software had resolved by doubling 2 of the remaining candidates. The pairing algorithm, which weighted its assignments toward candidates of equivalent performance ranking, had produced a systematic error in the gap-filling process that placed the first-ranked and last-ranked candidates in the same bay. Program Director Essek, a Vilhari administrator who had managed the program for 9 years, and who had in those 9 years seen the assessment produce results ranging from the expected to the genuinely remarkable, had reviewed the pairing before approving it. He had approved it because the rules permitted same-bay assessments, and because, in his considered judgment, the performance differential between the 2 candidates was sufficient that the arrangement would have no material effect on the outcome. Vitharakin would complete the scenario. Callum Reyes, in all probability, would not. The presence of one candidate in the bay while the other worked would be, at most, a minor logistical note in the assessment record. His deputy, a junior administrator named Torvin, who had joined the program 18 months ago, and who had, in that period, quietly become the staff member most likely to actually read the candidate files in full, had flagged the pairing for review. He had used the word atypical in his flag. Essek had read the flag, considered it, and approved the pairing anyway. He had not asked Torvin what specifically he had found atypical. The assessment bay assigned to the pairing was Bay 7, which was the largest of the facility's 6 bays and which had an observation tier along the upper wall that could seat 40. The observation tier was not typically occupied during assessments. For the final assessment of the semester, faculty attendance was standard practice, and the pairing had generated some comment in the faculty common room when it appeared in the scheduling system. Not comment that was hostile to Callum in any direct sense, but the specific comment of people who had looked at a performance differential and had already decided what it meant. The observation tier filled to capacity. The other assessment bays were staffed by monitoring systems and a rotating technician. Bay 7 had 7 faculty members, the program director, and Torvin, who had brought his data tablet and was standing slightly apart from the others. The scenario package for the pressure test that semester had been drawn from a real incident. A propulsion system cascade failure aboard a coalition survey vessel, documented 8 years earlier, that had left the ship without primary thrust in a debris field. The original engineering team had diagnosed and patched the system in 41 minutes. The assessment version gave candidates 45 minutes, 4 minutes longer than the documented real-world repair, which was considered generous by program standards. The failure was a nested one. The immediate visible symptom was a loss of injector pressure in the primary thrust assembly. The cause of that pressure loss was a microfracture in a secondary coupling that was not part of the injector system, and did not appear in any direct diagnostic pathway connected to it. The connection between the 2 components had been obscured by a design revision made 7 years after the original ship class had been commissioned. Every candidate who had attempted this scenario in previous semesters had begun with the injector system. Every candidate who had attempted this scenario in previous semesters had failed to complete it within the time window. It had been selected because it was the most difficult scenario in the archive. The assessment opened at 0800. Both candidates received their briefing packages simultaneously. Vitharakin began her diagnostic sequence immediately. Her process was precise and methodical. She opened the system manifest, cross-referenced the failure indicators against the 14 diagnostic pathways her training covered, and began working through them in order of probability. Her first pathway check took 4 minutes and produced a partial result. She moved to her second pathway. Callum did not open the system manifest. He stood in front of the thrust assembly for approximately 90 seconds. He was not visibly doing anything. From the observation tier, 2 faculty members made quiet comments to each other. One of them glanced at the program director. Then Callum put his hand on the outer casing of the assembly. Not on a diagnostic port, not on a panel. On the casing itself, flat-palmed the way someone puts their hand on something when they are trying to feel what it is doing rather than read what it is reporting. He held it there for about 15 seconds. Then he moved to the secondary systems housing, 2 meters to the left, and put his hand on that as well. Torvin, in the observation tier, had stopped looking at his data tablet. Callum straightened, walked to the tool cabinet, and removed 3 tools that were not, in any standard diagnostic protocol, tools used to begin a propulsion assessment: a thermal probe, a mechanical tension gauge, an acoustic sensor of the type typically used in structural integrity work rather than propulsion systems. He went to the secondary systems housing, not the injector assembly. From the observation tier, the comments had stopped. The faculty were watching in the specific silence of people whose expectations have been interrupted, not yet revised. What happened over the next 22 minutes was documented by the Bayes recording system. The assessment required a candidate to identify the fault, develop a repair approach, and execute it to functional restoration. Vithara Kin was working with precision and focus through the injector system, which was where every available diagnostic tool in the bay indicated the problem was. She was applying the correct methodology to the visible symptom. Her diagnostic accuracy was exceptional. She was solving the wrong problem, and she was doing it with complete technical correctness. Callum had located the microfracture. He had found it not through the diagnostic system, which did not flag it, but through the acoustic sensor, which detected a resonance pattern in the secondary coupling that did not match the operational baseline for a functioning component. The resonance pattern was not listed in any fault code in the scenario's documentation. It was the kind of indicator that had no formal name in engineering manuals, because it was the kind of thing that engineers learned to notice over years of listening to machinery in conditions where the formal systems were not available or not sufficient. Maurice Reyes had noticed it first in a pump station outside of Fort Nelson in 1987. He had written about it in his 3rd notebook. His grandson had read that notebook at the age of 14 and had understood, with the specific comprehension of someone who had already spent 3 years in a workshop, developing the same sensory vocabulary, exactly what his grandfather meant. The repair itself required a field patch approach, not the standard component replacement the scenario protocol assumed would be used, but a pressure-based temporary seal of the type used in field conditions when replacement parts are not available. The technique was not in the program's curriculum. It was not in the scenario solution documentation. It was in the 8th chapter of a maintenance manual for a pipeline pressure system that had been commercially obsolete for 15 years, which had been photocopied and placed in Maurice's 3rd notebook with a handwritten marginal note that said, "This works." At the 22 minutes, Noxus registered a restoration of full pressure across the secondary coupling. The cascade effect reversed. The injector system, which had been symptomatic rather than causal, normalized without direct intervention. The assessment board updated automatically. Vithara Kin, who had been working through her 4th diagnostic pathway with focused efficiency, stopped. She looked at the board. She looked at the thrust assembly display, which showed green across all indicators. She ran her own verification check, which confirmed what the board was showing. She turned and looked at Callum, who was returning the acoustic sensor to the tool cabinet. He did not make eye contact. He replaced each tool in the position it had occupied when he removed it. Then he walked to the system console and filed his approach documentation, which was a required step in the assessment process. The documentation section for diagnostic method used had a free text field. He typed, "Acoustic resonance check, secondary systems, field patch, secondary coupling." The attached methodology was 6 pages. It referenced a pipeline maintenance manual, 2 of his grandfather's notebooks, and 3 field reports from incidents in northern Alberta between 1989 and 2003. The assessment timer had 23 minutes remaining when he filed. The observation tier was quiet in a way that observation tiers rarely are. Essek was not looking at the board. He was looking at his deputy, who had anticipated this and was not looking back. Vithara Kin completed her assessment 17 minutes later, having eventually identified the fault through a comprehensive elimination process that was technically correct and considerably more thorough than any previous candidate's approach to the scenario. Her final time was 30 minutes. Her solution documentation was 40 pages. It was, by every formal measure the program used, an exceptional result. She had finished second. In the faculty common room after the session, the conversation was different from what it had been before. It was not the comfortable conversation of people who had seen what they expected to see. It was the conversation of people recalibrating, which is a different kind of noise, more uncertain, with longer pauses, and with the specific quality of people who are privately revising a position they had not technically stated out loud. Callum walked from Bay 7 to the candidate residential block at the same pace he walked everywhere, which was the pace of a person who has somewhere to be and expects to get there. He had his grandfather's acoustic sensor in his bag. He had brought it himself as personal equipment within the allowable personal tool policy, and he was thinking about the secondary coupling and the way its resonance had differed from its neighbors by approximately 4 cycles per second, which was the kind of difference that a diagnostic system wouldn't flag and a hand on the casing wouldn't catch, and an acoustic sensor held at the right angle for about 30 seconds absolutely would. His grandfather had written in the margin of that pipeline manual, "You don't always find things where they're supposed to be broken. Sometimes the system is honest and sometimes it isn't. Learn to tell the difference." He had been 11 when he first read that. He was 28 now, and it was still the most accurate description of diagnostic work he had ever encountered, in any language, in any curriculum, in any technical program, run by any institution in any part of the Coalition's reach. The semester's final ranking was posted to 1,600 hours. First place, Callum Reyes. Assessment time, 22 minutes. 4. Scenario status, complete. Fault correctly identified, yes. Repair method, field variant, non-standard fully functional. Methodology review pending. Non-standard approach flagged for curriculum evaluation pending. 3 weeks later, Program Director Essick added a formal notation to the semester review, the first formal notation he had added to a semester review in 9 years of program administration. It read, "Assessment framework requires supplementary evaluation criteria for candidates with applied field experience backgrounds. Current diagnostic testing protocol does not capture competency developed outside formal training channels. Recommend working group." He did not note in the review that he had been the one to approve the Bay pairing without reading Torvin's flag. In the candidate file system, the notation that had been entered in Callum's record at intake, admitted on procedural basis, was replaced by a staff member who completed the update without drawing attention to it with a single line, "See semester assessment record." Torvin, when he saw the updated file, said nothing. He had read the file in the first week of the semester. He had tried to mention it. There are things that are better left to demonstrate themselves, and there are things that are better left to institutions to quietly correct, and occasionally those are the same thing. The pipeline manual that had been photocopied into Maurice Reyes's third notebook sat in Callum's bag on the residential block shelf, held together with a rubber band and a binder clip his grandfather had attached to it sometime in the late 1990s. The clip was older than the Coalition's technical curriculum. The knowledge it held in place was older than the clip. Callum did not think about this in any formal sense. He thought about the 4-cycle resonance difference and about what it meant for how secondary couplings failed under specific pressure conditions, and about a handwritten note in the margin of an obsolete manual that had turned out to be, under whatever conditions, still correct. Some things did not have a category in the assessment system. They did not need one.